All right, welcome, comrades. Welcome to this next event in the Chicago DSA Internationalism series, a part of the Polyed committee. And we are joined today by three really special guests. I will be introducing them soon, but first I'm going to read a small write-up to introduce us to the topic of red baiting in the United States today and what it means for internationalism, socialists here, and socialists abroad. So one moment while I pull this up. All right. Red baiting is a practice as old as socialism itself. Meant to deride, intimidate, and minimize socialists and socialist thought, it has been extremely successful here in the United States over the past 100 plus years. We wanted to include this in the internationalism series for a very specific reason. Tying communists here to movements abroad or to paint leftists as sympathizers to foreign powers has always been a successful red baiting tactic. It can be used to delegitimize an organization by reactionaries and at times be deployed by leftists in the heart of the empire to justify appeasing Western chauvinism, thus limiting our scope of organizing. None of these circumstances should be seen as intimidating factors to those prioritizing internationalism, but they do deserve to be studied. Our panel today hopes to connect each of these areas of focus together and show you, our audience, what fighting against red baiting can mean for the socialists at home and abroad. We have a representative from Anakbayan, a militant left-wing organization from the Philippines, where red baiting has transformed into red tagging, a tactic used not only to intimidate and bully leftists, but to also make them victims of horrific levels of state violence. We also have a scholar here on Latin American history to speak on the effects of anti-socialist propaganda and how immigration and organizing from this region has been seen as a direct threat on American exceptionalism. And finally, we have an organizer here that has lived through the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, who will offer some perspective on how the US and Chinese relations may devolve into history repeating itself once more. Quickly, in the Philippines, the Duterte government has waged what can only be considered an all-out war against socialist organizing in the country, more specifically against communist groups and sympathizers in the more rural, mountainous regions. If you're a True Non podcast listener, you recently heard the story of Brandon Lee, one of the few Americans that has recently been targeted by a foreign government for assassination in the Philippines because of their work as an organizer there. This is not ancient history, but rather an ongoing reality for so many activists in this country. A movement that not only deserves more international attention, but one that can also help leftists all over the world understand how organizing in their own regions can grow into. Historically speaking, on the other hand, in Mexico, Cuba, El Salvador, Bolivia, Peru, Nicaragua, and almost any country in Central America, South America, and the Caribbean, there are long histories of socialist movements rooted both in Marxist tradition and basically peasant, worker, and slave revolts. For each of these movements in recent history, it has almost always been tied to anti-Western intervention and anti-further capitalist growth, or more plainly, anti-American involvement in the region. They have scared and intimidated the United States so much so that the anti-communist propaganda has nearly been perfected from the actions in these regions. The legacy of organized and militant organizing has shifted and changed over the years, but the efforts of foreign capitalist powers have not. Living in the belly of the beast deserves a more expansive conversation to help grow and adapt a movement capable of stopping it. And finally, throughout the Cold War, anti-Soviet messaging was everywhere. From children's stories to the halls of Congress, it was a major piece of the American identity until the fall of the Berlin Wall. But it could not stop there. America had become so comfortable with pro-capitalist, anti-communist messaging that it knew it had to adopt. It knew that it had to continue this animosity in some way. Since at least the early 2000s, China has been portrayed as a further and further threat, but has been seen as both a capitalist intimidator and somehow a communist authoritarian regime in one fell swoop. We have all seen countless op-eds regarding China as the most evil, controlling power the world has ever seen, while at the same time we are engaged in blatant and ongoing imperialist efforts that would make Roman emperors blush. Control over countries in Africa is seen as a Chinese homicidal, genocidal imperial effort, while the United States AFRICOM programs are completely left out of the mainstream discourse. So how can leftists have these conversations without seeming like fringe defectors, but also show support when needed to socialist projects? Each of these regions have a special place in American history because they dictate so many of our own actions today. From the Monroe Doctrine and some of the earliest efforts to control part of the world on behalf of the United States, to the Philippines as a gateway for access in the region for expanding American influence as a neo-colony, to China, who could set the future for all anti-socialist messaging in the US for years to come. This and many other topics are what we hope to cover tonight. Apologies for a very long introduction, but there's a lot to cover in this, so I think it's worth going through. I want to introduce each of our panelists tonight. I will give a short introduction, and then I will ask each panelist to introduce themselves to how they feel comfortable. So give me one moment, please. I want to start with, and that's not good. Hold on one second. I apologize, everybody. My mouse just lost connection. That's fun. Okay, Derek, you want to take over for me real quick, please?
Yeah, who are we introing?
We are just starting from the top of the intros.
Okay, so we're going to move into the segment tonight where each of the three panelists will be introduced one at a time and then given up to 10 minutes just to respond to the prompt in any way they so choose. After that, we'll move on to the Q&A section. So first step, as long as there's no objection, is Alexander Aviña. Alexander Aviña is a historian and professor and the son of undocumented migrants from Michoacan. He is currently an associate professor of history in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies at Arizona State University. His research focuses on 20th century Mexico with an emphasis on revolutionary movements, the Mexican left, state violence and terrorism, immigration, and the history of narcotics production and trafficking. In his engagement with a diverse array of media platforms, he comments on issues ranging from immigration, drug policy, and Mexican politics to the history of revolutionary movements and empire in Latin America. Alex, thank you very much for being with us tonight. Please take it away.
Great, thank you so much, Derek. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to chat briefly. I will be my own timekeeper, so I don't blabber on beyond 10 minutes. Listen, I think. Let me just say a couple of things before I move on to Latin America, and I eagerly await your questions, which are going to be much more interesting than what I'm going to start with.
Accessibility options.
Let me just start by making a brief point about the U.S. and thinking about how, in a way, red baiting is in the very DNA of the U.S., right? If we think about the Alien and Sedition Acts from the 1790s to the way that rebellious indigenous communities or rebellious slaves were treated, to the adding of ideological tests for anarchists in the 1890s to the early 1900s, all the way to barring communists in immigration so-called reform of the 1950s. It's the way I think about red baiting, the way I think about this nation state, settler nation state, as it deals with radical opposition. It stretches the entirety of U.S. history. And just so I can mention this before I forget, because I'm probably forget, if you want kind of like a master class of how to deal with race baiting, if you're an American or you're living in the U.S., definitely check out the great Paul Robeson's appearance before the HUAC committee in 1956. It's so good, and the way that he's able to respond to a really obviously hostile congressional committee that's trying to get him to admit to being part of the Communist Party, trying to get him to admit that he once said nice things about Stalin is really good. And he also responds to another thing that some of us may have faced, that whenever we articulate some sort of radical critique of the U.S., one of the first feedbacks or responses that we receive is, well, if you hate it here, why don't you just leave the country? And Robeson has this amazing quote where he says, well, I'm not going to leave here because my ancestors helped make this country. My ancestors were slaves that were brought here against their will, and they helped make this. And because of that, I'm not going to leave. So definitely, if you've never had a chance to check out his testimony before HUAC, it's readily available online, and you can even on YouTube, they have the audio version as well. It's powerful. And if you've never heard Paul Robeson's voice, it's like another experience. In terms of Latin America, I think, look, since I'm a historian of Mexico, I'll start with Mexico and then really quickly shift to something that I think is another really important moment of red baiting both insurgent revolutionary Latin Americans and their potential basis of solidarity in the U.S., which is Central America in the 80s. But the Cold War really marks a key turning point for the entire region. Right? So in a place like Mexico, Mexico had the 1910 revolution. It's the first great social peasant revolution of the 20th century. The first 10 years, 1910 to 1920, there was active, different phases, but there's active military battles and warfare going on. And from 1920 to 1940, it's more of the consolidation of the post-revolutionary state that emerges from the 1910 revolution. And in those 2 decades, there was moments of accommodation and spaces for radical communist and socialist parties, particularly at the local and the regional levels. So the mayor of Acapulco, Guerrero, in 1919, 1920, Juan Escudero, his nickname was the Lenin of Acapulco, which I think is like one of the coolest nicknames. And you also had another revolutionary in the southeast of Mexico, Felipe Carrillo Puerto, who also directed a mass socialist movement that actually managed to make some interesting inroads into indigenous communities in Southeast Mexico. But it's really, by the 1940s, particularly during World War II, which really starts to clamp down on some of the political spaces for leftist political parties that weren't willing to toe the line of the ruling party, which becomes the PRI, which would rule Mexico for 7 decades. That space really starts to disappear in the late 40s. And this is something that happens throughout Latin America, particularly in 1947, 1948. It's kind of weird if you go back and look at these 2 years, there's such I don't know, reading, researching, and teaching Latin American history, sometimes you feel like you go from one conspiracy theory to another. The tragedy is that these aren't conspiracy theories. But when you get to look at the year 1947, 1948, both in the US, but also within the broader region of Latin America, there's a sustained counter-revolutionary movement against socialists, communists, and other radicals throughout the region. In Mexico, you see this play out in the purging of communist and socialist labor leaders in powerful labor unions that had grown pretty close to the ruling PRI party in Mexico. And from there on out, revolutionary or radical movements in Mexico in particular, the red baiting, the accusation of being a red, a comunista, a socialista, could turn into a death sentence. Right? So in the research that I did for my first book on these peasant guerrilla movements in southern Mexico in the 60s and 70s, led by rural communist school teachers, the use of the term communist was it was basically marking them for horrific forms of state violence. Both discursively, but also actually materially, right? They actually faced the attacks of a state apparatus that managed to hegemonically define what it meant to be a Mexican and what it meant to be an anti-Mexican. And to be an anti-Mexican was to be a communist, was to be someone who was sympathizing, going against their nation, and using this really conservative nationalistic framework to discursively and politically delegitimize folks who were on the ground trying to implement socioeconomic revolutionary changes to better the lives of peasant communities in particular, but then also mark them for all sorts of counterinsurgent actions by the Mexican military and by a whole constellation of death squads and of different police forces, both at the federal and the local level. Moving from Mexico in the 70s, I mean, what this resulted in Mexico and throughout other parts of Latin America is this type of this type of red baiting is translated into a broader, quote unquote, dirty war against any group, organization, or individual deemed to be a national security threat. And this obviously took form in different ways according to different national contexts. You have Argentina in the late 70s, early 80s fall under a military dictatorship. We saw the disappearance of something like 30,000 people. The 30,000 people who were disappeared by the Argentine military, they were not all socialists or communists. But it didn't matter from the perspective of the ruling military junta. They were all lumped into that group, deemed to be national security threats, and suffered horrific state violence in the form of having their actual bodies disappeared, usually thrown off of airplanes or helicopters into the South Atlantic Ocean. And so it's interesting to think about what red baiting led to, for instance, in the US during the second Red Scare of the 1950s up until the early 60s, and how that is both similar to, but also radically different in terms of consequence for folks throughout Cold War Latin America that suffered a similar red baiting, but the consequences, the material consequences were so much more horrific. You know, in a place like Guatemala in the 1970s and 1980s, you know, just to be tagged as a university student or a labor leader was enough to get you disappeared, tortured, you know, picked up, tortured, and disappeared. In terms of moving as quickly, because I have like a couple minutes left, I don't want to go over my time. In Central America, one of the things that was, you know, once we have the 1979 Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua in 79, you have the emergence of armed revolutionary movements in El Salvador and Guatemala. It's really interesting to see how, particularly the Reagan administration during the 80s, applied their own red baiting strategies against, particularly against the Sandinistas. Right. So if you go back and if you read some of Reagan's testimony or description of the Sandinistas, it's almost like he's describing the U.S. He's projecting. He's projecting in terms of what the U.S. was actually doing on the ground, you know, as sponsoring and organizing state terrorism against a country of a few million. But in public, he articulated a discourse that represented the Sandinistas as the worst of the worst, right? They threw all sort of descriptors at the Sandinistas, and by default, those descriptors then will then fall upon the solidarity, a powerful solidarity movement in the U.S. that tried to push back against U.S. foreign policy in Central America. And everything from, you know, Reagan calling the Contras in Nicaragua, you know, these death squads, or these military junta leaders in Guatemala, right? Calling them the moral equivalent of the U.S. founding fathers, which in a way is kind of right? Like not in the way that he meant it, but I think in some ways he was inadvertently right. So stepping back and looking at the broader history of particularly Cold War Latin America from a U.S. perspective, from a U.S. foreign policy perspective, red baiting is just another counterinsurgent strategy that the U.S. and its local elite allies in the region have used to mark people for repression, to mark organizations for extermination. And if anything, what we've seen in the region during the Cold War, we see like the consequences of it. To make a brief connection to the present, and then I'll stop to allow my co-panelists to jump in. You know, one of the things that, as a Latin American, is one of the things that took me aback watching some of the Portland protests of the last couple of years was to see, you know, right-wing U.S. fascists wearing shirts saying, you know, Pinochet did nothing wrong, or or another shirt that said free helicopter rides for Antifa or something like that. You know, they're making direct connections to some of the horrific violence that occurred in Cold War Latin America, just that some of that violence that begins as through this form of like counterinsurgent red baiting. But anyway, I'll stop there and I eagerly await your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. For those in the audience, later on there will be audience Q&A. Max here is going to drop a URL in the chat. It's a form. If you could click on it and enter your questions there, we'll be able to read them out loud to the panelists a bit later. So our next panelist up is Carl Davidson. Carl Davidson's a former student leader of the New Left of the 1960s, serving as vice president and national secretary of Students for a Democratic Society. From 1968 to 1976, he worked on The Guardian News Weekly as a writer and news editor. Today, he's national co-chair of the Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism and a national board member of Solidarity Economy Network. After organizing for many years in both New York City and Chicago, he now resides in Beaver County, Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh, where he was born and raised. Carl, thank you very much for being here, and please take your time here.
Thank you. I'm no longer a co-chair at CCDS. I'm just a national committee member, and I'm also engaged with two other groups, Left Roots and Liberation Road, these days. So we should mention that. I've been, you know, as the introduction indicates, I've been at this for more than 50 years now. And one thing I will say is that there's one consistent thread that runs through that, and is that I've always been a friend of China. But it's meant different things at different times. Back in in the 60s and 70s, China was going through the militancy of the Cultural Revolution, and to say that you were pro-China meant, that you were a wild-eyed Maoist, and all sorts of strange images might pop up in your ideas to what you might be up to next. Whereas today, things are quite different. I will say this, I think red baiting has also changed a great deal inside the country. And one of the significant reasons for it is that there's no longer a common turn or a common form or anything like it. In other words, an apparatus that extends from, a major socialist power that has allies in the parties of various different countries. That was part of the reason that, the Communist Party could get red baited in the 40s and 50s and so on, is that they were considered to be an arm of the Soviet Union. China had some sympathetic Maoist parties throughout the world for a short time back in the 70s, but those are all gone now. And China is, while it has a conference that it holds now and then for all the different parties of the world that want to come to it, from the Democratic Party to Communist parties or whatever, it has absolutely zero interest in forming anything like a common turn. Added to the fact that in China today, the U.S. bourgeoisie is very much integrated into a good deal of it. There's many U.S. corporations have their factories in China, and they're very much interested in the Chinese market, and probably more so even than the American left. There's a big divisions on the American left about China. I'm one who's convinced that China is still on a socialist path, even though it's a very bumpy one, and it's at a very early stage. And there's both capitalism and socialism in China, and there's a tension between them. But when I get red baited, it's usually not for that. Sometimes I get red baited for being pro-Cuba or something like that. I just usually tell people, I said, look, my life's an open book. I'm a homegrown Beaver County, Pennsylvania Marxist, born and bred here. I'm not going anywhere. And what's more, none of us are. I said, socialism is a trend in the American political life. We're part of the political spectrum, so get used to it. And I thought that's my usual response, and people get sort of takes care of the issue, and then we go on from there. It could change. I shouldn't. I don't want us to be too comfortable, because it could change, and the reason it could change is because of I think a very dramatic turn of events in a global relationship with forces, and we're seeing them on our TV screens, watching the news all this week. What we're seeing is a decline of empire. And the exhaustion, domestically anyway, in terms of domestic policy, the exhaustion of neoliberalism. So what that means is that empires don't like to decline, they want to resist it. And so the key to it that's united sort of both Republicans and Democrats at the moment is the idea that they're going to make a pivot to Asia. They want to get out, they want to stop dilly-dallying around in the Middle East and places like that. They want to really try to focus their attention on Asia, and particularly China. And the reason why is that while the US has been engaged in 20 years of ridiculous, counterproductive, and genocidal nearly wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, China has been eating our lunch in terms of soft power, not only in Asia, but all around the world, Latin America, Africa, and so on. and it keeps getting, it's continued to develop into, one of the, before long, it will be the largest economy in the world. And it's also already called the workshop of the world in terms of its productive capacity. The Soviet Union was never able to reach anything like that. The Soviet Union was always somewhat considerably behind the US in a good number of ways, especially in terms of things like consumer goods and so on. And they had gone all out to spend a lot of their money on the arms race with the US. China has avoided that. They've spent enough money on nuclear weapons. I think they have probably about 200 of them. They decided that's enough to wipe out the US every which way. So they don't really need to build anymore. The US has 800 military bases all around the world. China has one fueling station in Djibouti. So the idea that China is another imperialist power just doesn't fit the facts. But what China is doing is it's being very successful. So that's why I think the red baiting is going to have a hard time. They can attack the forms of democracy that people have in China or other countries all they want. But I know one thing for certain: I would not wish our form of democracy on anyone, given the kinds of crap that we have to put up with. We all know very well what it is and all the restrictions that are being put on it and how it's being suppressed and so on. And you can read the Chinese press every day where they carry articles at some length about the suppression of voter rights and so on in the United States, and sort of, rubbing our noses in it. So, but I think that that there is a considerable, there's some unity right now in the ruling class on this one point. They do want to pivot towards Asia, and they do want to find some way to try to block or catch up with China in certain regards. They want to catch up with it in terms of its soft power influence around the world, and they want to try and harm or block its economic development. It's not so much that they're all that concerned about its military power. China has been exerting its military power only in the regions that are immediately close to it in the South China Sea and Taiwan and places like that, or in say Xinjiang or Tibet. But these are all Hong Kong. These are all part of China, and so the question that I've been arguing for what's the way to deal with this is I'm arguing these days that the most important organizing principle for the left and for even broader democratic forces, the peace movement and so on, is to take another look at something that was developed in an earlier period, which is what were called the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. These were developed by Zhou and Nehru in the Bandung Conference in the 1950s, and they've served as the basis of Chinese state-to-state relationships ever since, and how China conducts its relations with other countries. And not only that, China has urged, and they've been successful at having the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence reflected in the UN Charter. So you can find them in there as well. They're not simply a Chinese product, but they're the United Nations product. But what these do is give us a way to press demands on our own government that could help maintain peace and development in the world in a way that breaks from wars of aggression like that, or other or even new arms races or things like that. I think that it doesn't do us any good to demand that the United States foreign policy become anti-imperialist, because that demand is way too far left. Likewise, it's not all that helpful to continue as we have in demanding just organizing to focus one demand on, say, U.S. out of Afghanistan, or no more money to Israel, or something like that. Piecemeal. In other words, I'm trying to say that we need something more than this kind of piecemeal approach to foreign policy, but we need a way to advocate a democratic foreign policy, small d. And I think the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence can do that. Am I able to share my screen? I don't, oh yeah, it looks like maybe I am. Hold on here.
Well, Carl, we are, for your time right now, we are going to move on to the next person. But
I'm going to wipe up here in 30 seconds. If you just hang on here. Here are the 5 principles: mutual respect for each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity, mutual non-aggression, mutual non-interference, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexisting. So that's really what it boils down to. And I think that if we take that as our approach to the demands that we make on our own government, we'll be doing the best that we can to avoid a new Cold War with China.
Thank you very much, Carl. Our third and final panelist tonight is Adrian Bonifacio. Adrian's the national chair of Anakbayan-USA, the National Democratic Mass Organization of Filipino youth in the U.S. Anakbayan holds the belief that Philippine society today is not truly free nor democratic. It is under the control of U.S. imperialism, along with local landlords, big capitalists, and corrupt government officials. The national democratic struggle seeks to realize true national liberation for the country and the realization of the democratic rights of the people. Adrian, thank you very much for being with us tonight. Please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for hosting this panel, and to the other speakers for taking us into a really good dive into the topic of contemporary red baiting, and then also historically, and putting it into the context of global imperialism today. So today I'm going to be talking primarily about the Philippines and what red baiting means for our community and our diaspora. I have some photos just because I'm also a visual person, so I'll just be screen sharing that. Is that showing up okay?
That's fine.
Awesome. So be talking about fighting counterinsurgency in the Philippines. Alex talked about red baiting as part of a counterinsurgent strategy. And so that's also how I'll be talking about it today as well. And so just some brief background. Derek already gave a really great introduction of Anakbayan. So please visit our website if you want to learn more. But hopping right into it, just for some background on the Philippines and going into some history. So for folks who aren't so familiar, the Philippines is an island nation in Southeast Asia. There is a long history of colonization by different countries. Spain for many centuries, the United States at the turn of the 20th century, Japan during World War II. But because of that, there's also been a long history of revolution in the Philippines as well. One of the first anti-colonial revolutions in Asia was in the Philippines against Spain. The picture shown is just a depiction of the 1896 revolution waged against Spain, which was victorious against Spanish colonization, but at that time unable to fend off against US imperialism. And so for many decades, the Philippines was under US control. It controlled a lot of the politics, economy, the culture, right? And even though the Philippines was granted independence in 1946, the Philippines still continues to remain heavily under the influence of the US and other foreign powers as well. Particularly with the economy, there are many imperialist countries, the United States being the primary one that strangled the economy, keeping it backwards, especially with regards to land and agriculture, the agricultural sector of the economy. And so throughout the years, throughout the decades of these different forms of violence against the people, whether it's outright military violence or economic violence, you name it, the strongest opposition to this status quo in the Philippines have been communists, have been socialists, have been activists fighting for genuine liberation and democracy in the Philippines. what some people might refer to as National Democrats or National Democratic Activists. And so, you know, to go through history briefly, the first Communist Party in the Philippines was founded in 1930. They launched guerrilla warfare against Japan when they occupied the Philippines during World War II. There were different things that happened with that party. There were revivals of a militant youth movement in the 60s. In 1968, the Communist Party of the Philippines was refounded, and the year after that, their People's Army started waging People's War against U.S. imperialism and the local ruling class there. But this was not without, for those who were not taking up arms, there's also a very vibrant movement, mass movement in places like Manila and urban centers and even abroad. And so in 1998, Anakbayan was founded and continued that legacy of militant youth organizing in the streets. And so faced with this mounting pressure, this continual pressure to change the status quo, to put power really in the hands of people who had been disenfranchised, disempowered for so long, the Philippine government looked to counterinsurgency efforts, and it looked to none other than the counterinsurgency playbooks of the US, who had colonized it for so long and who had adopted these different counterinsurgency tactics. So that brings us to today, counterinsurgency in the Philippines. Many people might be familiar with the martial law under Ferdinand Marcos, who was the president and dictator for many decades in the Philippines, from the 60s all the way up until the 80s. So martial law was only one form of counterinsurgency against the people. Since then, the fascism hasn't really stopped in the country. Every single president since then has had a counterinsurgency plan to try to crush not just the revolutionary movement, but any kind of activist calling for change in society, right? Including organizations like Anakbayan once it was founded. And so the picture here is under the Macapagal Arroyo regime in the 2000s. Their counterinsurgency program was called Bantay Laya, or Freedom Watch. They have all these really nice sounding names: Freedom Watch, Community Spirit. But in reality, they led to enforced disappearances, death, extrajudicial killings, planting of evidence, and so on. And so this brings us to probably what folks are most familiar with is the current presidency of Rodrigo Duterte, who has made international headlines mostly for, well, actually for a lot of different things, but mostly for, at least initially, his war on drugs, his quote unquote war on drugs, which was in reality just a war on the poor, a war on activists, a war on Muslims, a war on peasants as well. And so under Duterte, what is notable is that he has really tried to consolidate power across all branches of the government and all agencies of the government for counterinsurgency operations, and to further things like red baiting or red tagging or terror tagging. Those things are kind of synonymous in the Philippines. And so what we have is called a whole of nation approach. This is what the government calls it, where the entire civilian bureaucracy, no matter if you're the Department of Health, if you are the Department of Budget Management, if you are the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, you are connected to the military apparatus, the police apparatus. And so some clear examples of that is during COVID-19, the pandemic. The main tool of the government to address the pandemic was militarized lockdowns across the country, in which checkpoints were established, staffed not by health professionals, but by military personnel who had just like thermometer, the temperature checkers, and that's all they did. There was no one deployed to do testing. There was no one deployed to do treatment. It was under military lockdown, and that's because the military is now embedded in agencies like the Department of Health. And so other things and agencies that have been created under Duterte that further counterinsurgency, that further red tagging are the anti-terror law, which also made headlines last year. It's a wide sweeping bill that basically criminalizes activism, and notably criminalizes activism not just within the Philippines, but also in the US and abroad. there's also an agency called the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict. Very long name, call it the National Task Force. But it goes and red tags people left and right, no matter if they are just overseas workers who are trying to get services in the midst of pandemic, or if they're youth activists who are demanding a stop to tuition increases, you're labeled as a communist terrorist. And so one case that I did want to highlight, the opening did mention Brandon Lee, a close friend of many of us in the Bay Area. But another person who was attacked, Alicia Lucena, member of Anakbayan, she came into the spotlight because she became central to a case where the government said she had been kidnapped and brainwashed and taken from her parents as a minor, even though she's well over age to make her own decisions. She continued to organize, but then the government actually kidnapped her again at a swabbing test, a COVID-19 test. The government set up a free swabbing test, and military were deployed there, and they kidnapped her. And she underwent different forms of psychological torture at the hands of military agents and her own mother, who became a state agent. And she was only recently able to escape. And so I can definitely drop links of what's happening with her case right now. But it's beyond that in the Philippines as well. It's beyond the Philippines as well. In the United States, there's also cases of counterinsurgency and red baiting. The pictures here are, the one on the left is of myself. I'm a communist terrorist and we must stop the lies. And so at least they chose a photo of me with a mask on, so it's harder to tell who I am. But many of my fellow activists are tagged, publicly doxxed as so-called communist terrorists because we are challenging what the state does and its ineffectiveness in serving the needs of the Philippine diaspora, which is largely in the United States as well. The bottom photo here is of a tour of indigenous people who are sellouts of the government, sellouts of indigenous land, and they're also state agents. And so our activists went to protest a speaking tour that they had, and the government, the officials at the consulate, Philippine consulate, responded through physical violence. This is a fellow organizer who was literally choked by people in the Philippine consulate staff. On the right side here, and I'll wrap up soon, but on the right side here was just this past July, where at the same time that some of my activist colleagues were holding a protest in front of the Philippine consulate to deliver what is the real state of the Filipino people. The Philippine consulate in New York, together with other pro-Duterte forces, did community flyering in restaurants, red tagging or red baiting our organization, saying that we are communist terrorist fronts as well. And you can just see how confused this business owner is looking at this flyer that they're handing out, which just shows how ridiculous these operations are and how much of a waste of money this is, especially when there are migrant workers in need of real services from the government. And so what can we do? We're all here because we want to learn how to take action and not just learn how to learn about the issue. So just dropping a couple of flyers here. On Friday, there's going to be a virtual tour of an urban poor community, some of the places that are hardest hit by the government's fascism, state neglect, and also red tagging. San Roque has been a large site of people's struggle against demolition, against red tagging, and so on. So there will be a virtual community integration happening. I can send all these details to the organizers so that they can email it out to you. In Chicago, I live in the Bay Area now, but I am a Chicago born and raised. So our chapter in Chicago is working with the Malay movement to also hold an art build against fascism. The anniversary of the declaration of martial law is coming up on September 21st. And so folks are coming together to create signs, protest art to prepare for that. On the 18th, we're going to be holding a national summit for human rights and democracy in the Philippines, where we'll also talk a little about red tagging and red baiting and the many different other forms of political repression in the Philippines. And then, of course, you can support Anakbayan as an organization. Join, donate, go to our site, connect with people, and ask questions. Thank you all.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I apologize earlier for my technical difficulties, so I am back now. Yes, and Max just dropped in the chat to make sure that you all submit your questions to the panelists here, but first I will be going through some pre-written questions, and I've already adjusted them from everybody's talk because they were super informative and changed the direction of what I wanted to focus on. So I want to start again with Alexander. Can you talk a little bit about solidarity efforts in maybe at least throughout the 20th century up until the 21st century of socialist movements throughout Latin America and Socialist America and Socialist America, Central America, and ways in which that they came together to fight against these narratives of red baiting, or you know, not let these red baiting tactics get in their way, but actually build a solidarity movement for a more international working class movement.
Yeah, thanks, Matt, for the question. I can think of two specific ones. The first one is actually in early 20th century Mexico, from about the mid early 1900s to about 1911, 12, 13. You had the transnational labor organizing happening on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border, right? And this is where like the Wobblies become famous, right? So the Wobblies, through this transnational labor organizing of particularly miners, a multi-ethnic, multiracial coalition of miners, they're able to kind of transcend that imaginary line in the sand, and they're also able to make inroads with anarcho-syndicalists in Mexico, like the famous Flores Magón brothers, and the fact that the border wasn't as militarized back then, although as a consequence of the 1910 Mexican Revolution, it would become more militarized. There was kind of a transnational fluidity that allowed, radicals, anarchists, anarcho-syndicalists, and other left-wing activists to seamlessly cross the border and create links through labor organizing and through the writing and the distribution of radical newspapers and pamphlets. So like the Ricardo Flores Magón, who was the most famous, I think, Mexican revolutionary who adopted this tactic. He would set up shop in a variety of different southwestern U.S. cities, and they would start writing their famous newspaper, Regeneration, Regeneración, and they would start to distribute it, and this new radical newspaper would make its way through different working class communities in the Southwest and in the borderlands. You also have this incident where the Wobblies, working with these anarcho-syndicalists in Mexico that were grouped around. They have a weird name. They were called the Mexican Liberal Party, the PLM, but they were not liberal by that point. And they actually invaded Baja California. In 1910, 1911, there was a moment where they managed to take one or two major cities in Baja California. And it was really a motley group of Wobblies, of these PLM anarchists, anarcho-syndicalists, and then just like adventurers who went and actually managed to raise the red and black flag over a couple of cities. But I think it was really through labor organizing and focusing on particular sectors of labor, in this case miners, that did a lot to create a really interesting solidarity movement that allowed for this transnational fluidity. The other instance that I mentioned earlier was this broad solidarity movement that emerged in the U.S. during the 1980s in solidarity with these different revolutionary Central American movements. It's a really interesting solidarity movement. It was heterogeneous. It was grassroots. It had, an important segment from evangelical Christian churches, important segments from the Catholic Church. You had academics. You had committed American leftists who traveled to a place like Nicaragua and helped work in different literacy campaigns in Nicaragua. The professor who mentored me in college and who got me to think about, it's her fault that I'm a historian, Mirna Santiago, she actually went to Nicaragua in the 80s and helped participate in some of these literacy campaigns. So you actually had movements of Americans who were committed to supporting these revolutionary movements in Central America, particularly in Nicaragua, while domestically you had this grassroots coalition of different left-wing political parties, church groups, immigrant rights groups that started to emerge in the 80s. And they organized street marches. They organized the taking of public spaces to articulate a response to the Reaganite approach to describing the Sandinistas, the FMLN in El Salvador, or the guerrilla coalition in Guatemala. You also had an important segment of refugees, right? So because of US support for death squad regimes in Central America, you started to get Central American refugees. And some of these refugees from Central America, particularly El Salvador, would then set up solidarity organizations particularly in California. But you have instances in where like the committee that I'm thinking about is called CISPES. I mean, you had CISPES activists who were targeted, violently assaulted. There's one case of a CISPES activist who was kidnapped by Salvadorian death squad people who were in the US. She was raped, she was detained against her will, and then later dumped. But so the type of state terror that this person had fled from El Salvador actually followed her all the way to Los Angeles, California. But it was this broad, unwieldy coalition of different grassroots organizations that did their best to counteract the narrative of the US government. And they also had things like, in this instance, I think it did have some impact. They did a lot of, they were really noisy when it came to writing letters to Congress people, right? And to force them to pass things like the Bowles Amendment that prevented the US government from legally supporting the Contras. Of course, Reagan and his folks, if you know something about Iran-Contra, they found some pretty shady ways, and with drugs, to go around the law, to skirt the law and find clandestine ways of supplying the Contras. But the fact that these were pretty broad grassroots coalitions, I think but they also suffered a lot of reprisals, right? So I think the point here, I think both the earlier example and the later one that I just mentioned is the solidarity movements have to begin at the bottom. And they have to make inroads and make connections to grassroots organizations that are already around making, working with some of the issues related to, like in the 1980s, related to US foreign policy in Central America. So these church groups were working with the issue of refugees and migrants, but that then led them to like a broader, more radical critique of US foreign policy in the region. And it made them pretty vociferous critics of that US foreign policy. All right, that was a super long answer, sorry. But those are like the two main examples that I can think of.
No, that was very much appreciated. And I think making those connections throughout history show that this is possible to happen again, and it will look different, but it's, to learn and see what it means and move forward with that. I want to move next to Carl, same kind of time, just 5-7 minutes. But you were mentioning a lot about specific actions that could now be taken, that American leftists can take to challenge this, Cold War narrative against the China rather, and what activists within the United States can do to make more direct asks. Recently, the DSA International Committee just put out a great statement in support of, or condemning rather, the actions by Congress trying to start another Cold War and things like this. And can you kind of expand a little bit more on maybe, the legacy of what anti-Cold War activism looked like throughout the 20th century between the US and the USSR, and kind of similarly to how Alex maybe ways to connect it to what we can do now, or ways to think about it now?
I think there's some important differences. The way we fought the Cold War in the past was mainly aimed at the Soviet Union and the two superpowers, and the main instruments we used were, number one, a broad peace movement and campaigns for nuclear freeze and nuclear disarmament to try and take on the danger of nuclear war and any confrontation that would take place between the two. And the U.S. has been rather aggressive towards the end of, locating all sorts of mid-range nuclear-tipped missiles in Europe and so on. But I think we were as quite as shocked as anyone about how rapidly the Soviet Union changed and then collapsed. We saw Gorbachev's changes as somewhat a positive development, but then all of a sudden the Soviet Union wasn't there anymore. And it sort of took everybody for a loop. I mean, we started talking about things like, well, the Cold War is over, so let's have the peace dividend, but it never really materialized because the U.S. then had to and began shifting its gears and find its fish in other frying pans. The thing I think that's to understand about the current situation is that at that time when we had a battle between hegemonies of two superpowers, but now we have an order where the U.S. has been hegemonic for some time, but is losing its grip. And what it's going to be replaced with is not a hegemony on the part of China. China is not the least bit interested in hegemony. What China wants is a multipolar world, which is something that probably most of the world can get behind, which is one good reason that they're for it. And they make the point that they're not interested in hegemony. They're not interested in 800 military bases anywhere. But at the same time, they're quite strong. And one difference is that if the US does try to wage a Cold War with China, it could get very dangerous very quickly, because I think the Chinese would win because they're in a very strong position, much stronger position than, say, the Soviet Union was at the height of the tensions between the US and the USSR. The Chinese Communist Party enjoys a great deal of support within the country. The living conditions of the people have been, steadily improving over decades. Dire poverty has been wiped out for 400 million people. So China enjoys a great deal of support, not only at home, but abroad. So what that would mean for the US to ramp things up, they're going to have to be provocative. They're going to have to try to send US Navy ships into the South China Sea. They're going to have to interfere with the negotiations around the different islands between China and Vietnam and China and the Philippines. They're going to have to try to ramp up tensions around Taiwan. And one thing is certain, China will not brook any interference in Taiwan or Tibet or Xinjiang. And people should be very clear about that. When MacArthur was advancing towards the Chinese border back during the Korean War, he was told not to do it, but he went ahead and did it anyway. And the Chinese put out a very simple statement that says, "We will not stand idly by." So when China speaks with these, very understated, very simple, straightforward terms, you have to believe them and take them seriously. They will not stand idly by at any kind of interference in Xinjiang or Tibet or Taiwan. That doesn't mean that they're going to take over Taiwan by force of arms. I think that their idea is that over good time, they will eventually have a peaceful reunification. But the US, to try and heat up this conflict, may start getting provocative. And that's where the danger comes in. Because the only way that the US can fight, if the US tries to fight China in Chinese neighborhood with our military, they will lose very quickly, which means that will escalate very quickly to the question of nuclear weapons. And that's where it gets dangerous. So I think it's very much in our interest and the interest of the American people, most broadly speaking, and the entire world, really, to pay attention to the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and make those demands. That almost every country in the world can pretty easily observe the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. The one country that has a great deal of difficulty observing them is the United States, and that's a good reason for us to press them.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I appreciate that response. Moving on, once more, yes, Max, drop the form in the chat if you want to submit questions. We will be doing that after this. But my last prepared questions for Adrian, can you talk a little bit about how the US is directly or indirectly responsible for the situation in the Philippines, and how much US energy has gone into more recent, supporting this martial law, more recent efforts by the Duterte government in receiving, aid from the US, and, what has the United States turned their back to, which in effect emboldens this kind of fear and terror tactics on the part of the government?
Yeah, great question. The first thing that comes to mind is the long history of military aid and support that has been given to the Philippines from the United States. In the last, I'd say since around 2016 or so, it's been almost more than half a billion dollars in US aid. And this is squarely under the Duterte presidency, which, maybe the US had an excuse before because previous presidents, while they definitely were practicing counterinsurgency operations against the people, weren't as blatant in their attacks against the people. But under Duterte, it's very obvious, right? We have the war on drugs, we have war on the poor, we have war on activists, and so on. And yet, hundreds of millions of dollars in aid. These are war helicopters, missiles, other forms of ammunition are going to the Philippines. I think just this year alone under Biden, there were a couple $1 billion arms contracts that were approved by Congress, despite Biden's promise to not cozy up to dictators. In fact, I know the Biden administration is having a summit for human rights as well in December, which is things that we should hold the Biden administration accountable for, right? If you say that you are for protecting human rights in your foreign policy, then why do you continue to send millions of dollars of aid to countries that are attacking its own people? And this is, we could say so much more about the politics in this country as well, in terms of attacking people here in the United States. But outside of that, there's also counterinsurgency trainings. Duterte's daughter, who is vying to, people are thinking that she's going to be running for president during next year's elections in the Philippines. The presidential elections are next May in the Philippines, and the Duterte family, dynasty, and its party are trying to do many things to stay in power. One of them being for his daughter to run as president, the other being for Duterte himself to run as vice president. And so there are people within his family that are getting counterinsurgency trainings here in the United States. Sarah Duterte, his daughter, was here 2 years ago for that very same reason, visited DC, visited Southern California to receive training from people. And then, of course, there's a pretty constant influx and flow of people who are from the Philippine military that study at West Point and go on to serve US interests in the Philippine military and government. And so the current defense secretary in the Philippines is a graduate of West Point. There are many others who are part of this militarized civilian bureaucracy who have received direct training from the United States. And so through that aspect, there's still a lot of US control over the politics and military. Another big thing that I'd like to point out too is definitely the economic aspects of where the US has some skin in the game in terms of continuing to extend its influence over the Philippines. And the reason why that's important is because many of the corporations that are profiting from Philippine labor, from Philippine resources at the expense of the Filipino people are the very ones that are being defended by security forces, by paramilitary agents that are on the one hand receiving funding from the US as well, receiving training, and then also directly benefiting multinational corporations that are found in the US and otherwise. And so there's many different aspects of how the US supports and encourages red baiting and other counterinsurgency tactics because it benefits its own geopolitical interests and its own economic interests in the region.
Wonderful. Thank you for that answer. I'm also reminded of a recent quote by Nicolas Maduro that the US was trying to paint him as a, dictator and all of these things. And, he very bluntly pointed out, dictators are born out of Harvard. They're graduates of Harvard and they are graduates of West Point and things like that. And he said, I'm a graduate of the streets of Caracas. So that's a very different, it's a very different place. And you see the red baiting happens to us all, right? So right now, I'm going to throw it over to my comrade, Raymond. They will read off a few questions that the audience has submitted, and then we will say goodnight from there. So Raymond, please take over.
Yes, hello, comrades. Hope you all are doing well. Yeah, I really like Adrian's point about the West Point things. I mean, it's like, oh, they'll demonize Maduro, a bus driver who was a bus driver first, president later, and then, you know, in the same wing, like praise Duterte, who's like trained by the US itself in the States and his family. So, you know, ironic, right? So, but anyways, I have a question for Professor Aviña, and it is, what events or movements in current day Mexico make you feel hopeful? And after Aviña gives his answer, the other speakers can give their answer too. So take it away.
Thank you. Let's see, that's a good question. I think there's a couple movements. I think one movement that has a lot of moral power and authority, precisely because it's born out of horrific tragedies that most of us don't ever really read about or hear about, are these different movements of the families and relatives of the disappeared, who have become a really vocal social movement in terms of pressuring the Mexican state to do more. One, to bring back, to provide evidence, to give information as to what happened to loved ones who have been disappeared. The estimates, there's an official database that says that from 2006 to today, there's about 91,000 people in Mexico that have been disappeared, right? So that's like cases that we have good evidence for. Reality is it's probably way over 100,000. So you have all these different movements, somewhat dispersed, but locally and regionally, but they're slowly starting to coalesce into something bigger. And they're a pretty, I mean, it's a horrific thing to think about. I did research about this act of disappearing people at the Mexican state in the 60s and 70s. And actually, when I was doing research on this in like the mid 2000s, late 2000s, a family member of mine was disappeared right at in Michoacan, right when the drug war started, so-called drug war, that violence started ramping up. I think this is one of the most urgent things that the Mexican state has to confront and deal with. And you have an emerging social movement from below that is doing, on the one hand, vocally criticizing the inability of the Mexican state to deal with this, or actually accusing them directly of participating in these disappearances. But on the other hand, they're also like doing the work of a state, right? They're the ones who are actually going out into the countryside, into the mountains, into the fields, and digging things up, risking their own lives to try to literally physically find the remains of their loved ones. Another one is a strong emerging feminist movement. Mexico's also had this issue of feminicide and for the last 30 years. So you have a more radical feminist movement that has emerged in the last 5 to 10 years. I think that's also become an important one. And to me, I'm still, I became highly politicized in the mid 90s. I grew up in California, so it was a wave of anti-immigrant state legislation that helped politicize me, in addition to my parents' own situation of being undocumented migrants. But then in 1994, the Zapatistas emerged in Mexico, and they still continue to surprise you. They still continue to inspire. And I don't know if any of you followed this, but they recently sent a delegation of indigenous Zapatista activists to Europe to conquer Europe, and to spread the message of Zapatismo and indigenous rights, and recasting narratives of indigeneity, and really trying to recast Mexico's history as that of a settler state as well, which has caused a lot of discomfort for a lot of Mexicans. So I think those are the three that I look at as providing a lot of hope in really dark days, right? Again, probably well over 1,000 people disappeared as a consequence of the so-called drug war that began, well, the latest version began in 2006. We're probably close to 400,000 to 500,000 people dead as a conflict, somehow related to that conflict as well. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay. Yeah, I think that was a good answer. I particularly thought it was just insightful to kind of bring up the missing family members and just missing people in Mexico in general, right? Because it's not just Mexicans too, it's Central Americans as well. And I think that's just kind of a part that it's often forgotten about, even though it's still a reality for many Mexicans today and Central Americans, who are trying to get to the US. So I have a question for any speaker to answer, but I kind of am interested to hear what Adrian has to say. And after Adrian speaks, the other speakers can go ahead and answer this question. But the question is, how would you begin to disrupt the false conflation of socialism / Marxism with quote unquote authoritarianism in people's minds, or in the minds of the masses of regular people?
Great question. Question we have to definitely tackle within organizing in the Filipino community as well, and among our allies. I think one of the things that we have to take a look at is who are we talking about when we, and what is our frame of reference when we talk about authoritarianism, right? Are people thinking of authoritarianism as, the few rich people who are dictating our economy? Are we thinking of those who have amassed wealth and translated that into politics and are ruling countries like the United States for that matter, but especially in places like the Philippines under the guise of democracy, but really in an authoritarian way in terms of whose interests they protect? And then shift that perspective, and then also shifting the perspective of how do people look at social movements, whether they're socialist or not, in terms of who are the people that they're trying to empower, right? Is it the people from the grassroots? Is it people from below? Is it the marginalized and oppressed peasant masses? Is it the factory workers, the service workers that for the longest time have not been able to have a voice in their lives, right? In the Philippines, one of the biggest contradictions is that the Philippines is so rich, but the people are so poor, right? The Philippines is a net importer of rice, despite so many people being rice farmers. And yet they have no say over what they can grow on their land. They have no say over what they can do with the rice that they do produce, right? And so when you take a look at social movements and you take a look at the question of power and who are they trying to build power among, right? That's the narrative we need to shift. Whose authority do we want to listen to? Is it the authority of the majority, right? Is it the majority of the people who have been silenced but know the most about how to take care of the land, how to run the economy in a way that will benefit the most? Isn't that the type of people's government we want? And shift that from the authority of the ruling few that is the current status quo, right? And so I think that's the kind of work in terms of cultural shifting that we need to do, that of course red baiting makes it really difficult to do because there is such a stigma around activism, around socialism, but we really need to break down some of these concepts in a way that people can understand and can relate to their own experience. Because for many people, my family members who are like scared, terrified of things, that anything socialist, will agree with me on daily conversations about shouldn't migrant workers have a say in how much of the government budget should be allotted for them if they're in distress abroad, right? And that's the kind of authority of the majority that we're looking for.
I'll bite. I think the term is usually a fudge factor. It's meant to cover a variety of sins. Authoritarianism, that is. I don't usually use it. I usually tell people that we get to socialism by winning the battles for democracy. And when it comes to talking about the Trumpified Republicans, I refer to them as right-wing populists with a fascist core. And I think that's more accurate. I don't usually call them authoritarians or something like that. But I know some people like to make this broad sweeping thing as a struggle in the world is between democracy and authoritarianism, and they lump Trump together with China and Cuba and everything else, which I think just muddies the waters. Cuba is each country gets to define democracy in its own way and to fight for it in its own way. Cuba has a one-party government, but when its elections are extremely democratic, and they have them all the time. China has probably more elections than we do, but they're very hierarchical in a way that we're not. And it would, in their system would not fit with our cultural realities at all. But it seems to work where they are. So I just toss it aside. The path to socialism is by winning the battles for democracy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Since we're low on time, we're going to have to cut the questions there. But this is a little bit of an awkward last 10 minutes. I really want to thank everybody for coming out, and thank you for speaking today. There were so many great things. Adrian, your input reminded me of a great Parenti quote that there are, these countries are not underdeveloped, they're overexploited. And I think that's something to keep in mind when we think about these countries that we want to build relationships with, that we want to build connections to these social movements. Alex, I think you touched on some really great histories on the myriad of socialist movements within a lot of Latin America and especially Mexico. It gives birth to a lot of different ways of defeating capitalism and ways of organizing around it, and new connections that could be made. And Carl, thank you so much for talking about what the future might look like, and how we should kind of be prepared for it, and learning from the past in that regard as well. So with that, I'll go each speaker by speaker, but to kind of, offer your input of where we can find you, where what projects you might be working on, what things we can check out. And I'll start with Alex really quickly.
Thanks a lot, Matt. You can find me talking shit on Twitter, Alexander_Aviña. Yeah, and I the current project, I'm working on a couple things. I started as a contributing writer for this foreign exchanges Substack, and I just published my first article on kind of thinking about the U.S.-Mexico border as a primary site of U.S. empire. And now I have to work on part 2. For some reason, I told them I would do 2 parts, so I actually have to do the second part, where I'm focusing on Arizona, and in particular one fortress in Arizona that began as in the fight against the Apaches in Geronimo, and is now like the world's largest drone training base. And it's like the history of this fort, just like such a cool event. Well, not cool, but it's very illuminating look at the development of U.S. empire from the 19th to the 20th century. And I'm working on a book on the history of Mexican drug wars and state violence and terrorism since the 60s and 70s. But thank you so much. This was great. Thank you to my co-panelists. This was great. Thank you for the invitation, Derek. Thank you for being patient. I know you invited me way back last year and I couldn't make it, but I'm glad that I finally had a chance to join you all today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Alex, you might also know my professor, Adam Goodman. He was a former professor of mine. He's written a lot on the immigration between the US and Mexico. And
yeah, I've used his book so much. That's a great book. Thank you.
That's great. Yeah, he's awesome. Next, I want to give Carl, where can we find you? I know you dropped a link in the chat.
Yeah, the link is for the online university at the left, which is my favorite project these days. Go there and be amazed at all of this stuff you can find. And if you forget the URL, just online university to the left and my name, and you'll get there. And some people think I helped invent Facebook, and I tend to dominate a certain corner of it anyway. So you can always find me there, links to a number of different projects that I'm engaged in.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And like I was saying earlier, I totally by accident found Carl's writing from the 60s when he wrote about the split between the SDS and Progressive Labor Party. That was just complete accident. And now we're doing a panel discussion together. And that's a very cool piece to see and talk about as well, still to this day. So thank you very much. Glad to see that there's still a lot of that work going on. And last but certainly not least, Adrian, where can we find you? And you dropped so many links already. If you want to drop any more, please feel free.
Yeah, sorry, I have many links. But you can find us at Anakbayan-USA.com. And then you can also email us directly at anakbayan-usa@gmail.com. So I can type that in the chat too. But thanks so much for having us. I learned a lot today.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to end. Thank you so much to everybody that helped put this together. Thank you to all the panelists for coming on. Thank you for sitting through a technical glitch on my part. And we will have this video soon, hopefully within the next few days to a week. The sooner the better. And we will be sharing it, and you will be able to share it with, you know, comrades, colleagues, and friends. With that, we will say good night. Thank you, audience, for showing up. And we will see you next time. This will not be the last, and be sure to keep an eye on Chicago DSA. Good night.
Bye, comrades.